All right. Welcome, everyone. We're so glad you're here for our Standards Revision Lab, and welcome back from lunch. Great to have you here for the day. Normally, we would love to be finishing up a wonderful dessert before we come into our afternoon session, but we're so glad you're with us, and we'll give folks a little bit of time to stream into the room. And we just, as we come in, we would love to hear in the chat box, put your name, your location, and how many Learning Forward conferences have you been to? We know this is your first virtual Learning Forward conference, but we wonder if you've been to others. Just get a chance to talk to folks in the room a little bit. And we'll let you know that we love seeing your faces. If that's the way you roll this afternoon in your learning session, we will get to a point when our wonderful panel speaks, and we will feature them and the moderator, happens to be me. But for now, if you want to be on camera, we love to see you. And we will talk about our standards. And I think a couple more people will come into the room. Thanks for sharing where you're coming from. First conference, so glad to see we have some first timers here, and then folks with more experience. That's wonderful.
Yeah, there's someone with 8 years. That's impressive too. Thanks. Great.
Some Texas folks, some East Coast folks. That's wonderful. A couple of Colorado people. That's great.
I laughed when I first saw I forgot my location because I thought it meant you forgot where you were, but it really meant you forgot to put it in the chat box.
I'm keeping track of my location, but I'm having a hard time keeping track of the month, day, year. Well, welcome, folks. We're going to get started here in just a minute, and wonderful to see some of our Standards Advisory Council folks in the room in addition to our panelists. And I think we'll go ahead and get started. Denise, why don't you kick us off?
All right. Well, I tell you, it is so wonderful to have all of you here. Wish I could see more. And again, as Tracy said, we certainly wish we could all be together, but we're doing certainly the next best thing with Learning Forward's first virtual annual conference. So welcome to everyone from all time zones. And I'm Denise Glenn Borders, President and CEO of Learning Forward. And I'd like to first introduce the other three members of our wonderful Learning Forward Standards team. So Tracy Crow, who was just speaking, is our Chief Strategy and Communications Officer. And Paul Fleming, who will wave to you, is our Senior Vice President of Standards, States and Equity. And Elizabeth Foster is our Vice President of Research and Standards. And we have just an incredible panel for you today, just incredible people. And I'll ask you all to do a wave when I introduce you just quickly. Eric Hirsch, who's the Executive Director of Ed Reports. Michelle Alaya, Literacy Director, Ohio Department of Education. Linda Rost, 2020 Montana Teacher of the Year, Baker High School. And Jim Short, Program Officer for Leadership and Teaching, the Carnegie Corporation of New York. So these are just incredible folks that are really going to help us focus on this session of our revision lab, Standards Revision Lab, and the focus is on curriculum. So again, we couldn't be more excited about coming together in the Standards Revision Lab to hear insights from these prestigious panelists and to share really the first round of the Learning Forward Revised Standards, which you should all have access to now. They're accessible. We've sent links to many of you, and they're accessible on our website and will be accessible with a link that we're going to be putting in the chat as well. And we've just received such valuable input from our Standards Advisory Committee, which we call our SAC, and our Learning Forward Board, our affiliates, our foundation, and our staff. And first, I just want to give a few reflections just to share about the journey that Learning Forward has taken to get to this point. And our standards team has really been meeting weekly, sometimes several times a week since January, since the beginning of the year. And as I said before, we've really been steeped in guidance from our Standards Advisory Committee, board and staff, and many of our members. And we've learned so much in the process. And we have really recognized through our support of districts how challenging this environment has been with the pandemic, back to school starts, but we've just learned a great deal in terms of what the real needs are out there are that we've really tried to respond to, both in our work and through the standards. And through our weekly webinars with leaders and teachers, which we really started at the beginning of the pandemic weekly, which has continued up until this point, we've reinforced how important it is. Teachers and leaders have really reinforced how it's more important now than ever to ground education in the highest quality professional practice and standards, no matter what the delivery, because there are so many new skills to learn in this environment, as well as the changing nature of so many contexts. We've immersed ourselves in research on myriad industry and professional standards in the US and globally, because we really made a commitment to make sure that our standards are international and relevant across the globe. And we've been very intentional about equity being threaded throughout the standards, and really the standards are really being a lever for equity. It's been clear that the standards to us really should be structured as aspirational, directional, and actionable. And we have added areas that speak to essential actions, exemplars, and vignettes. We've been focused on coherence and committed to multiple iterations and considerations. So we look forward to digging in today on our very specific focus area of curriculum and experiencing a rich discussion, as I know we'll have with these incredible panelists. And we want your direct and honest feedback and insightful questions as it relates to this area and the importance for the standard. So with that, Tracy, back to you.
Paul, I think you're going to walk us through the agenda for this afternoon.
Yeah, thank you, Denise and Tracy, and welcome everybody to our panel. As Denise mentioned, we're really excited to spend our time together a little under 2 hours in kind of 3 major areas. One is to give you a better sense of the standards revision process, since we are committed to making it public and shareable and more visible and iterative to get to this process of the draft standards. Second is to hear from our outstanding panelists. And rich discussion that we urge you to use the chat box to pose questions that we will then take and ask to the panelists, and Tracy will be moderating that section. And then third, kind of walk you through and show you the actual revised standards and show you an example standard as well, before giving you an opportunity to engage and give some feedback before we wrap up as well. So we know it'll fly by, but we're getting excited to have everybody here for us. And Tracy's going to kick us off with kind of the brief background and overview of both the current standards and where we're going right now. So Tracy.
Thanks, Paul. We're taking our opportunity to have 4 of these standards labs at our virtual conference. And we named them very intentionally because we really want the standards revision process to be as transparent as possible and to be informed by as many stakeholders as possible. And so we really appreciate you coming and learning about this, raising your questions. And then I hope as you walk away, you are excited about the opportunity to provide input on that draft that we put out there. And that's a 6-week period. So hopefully you'll have time to delve into it a bit and send some information back to us. It's so very helpful for us. So thank you for doing that. And so with our panel discussion, we're going to share about the conversation about the questions we're working to address. And so as Denise said, put your questions in the chat box. So I'll start by sharing a bit of information on the standards for professional learning, a little bit of history before we get into where we're headed. So I know that many of you are familiar with standards, and maybe some of you who are coming to your first conference, maybe you haven't had an opportunity to learn these yet. And so thank you for spending some time with us. The standards for professional learning describe the conditions for and elements of high quality professional learning that leads to improvements in educator practice and student outcomes. The revision that's in process now is leading us toward what will be the fourth version of standards for professional learning. And since 1994, built into their premise is that they should serve the educators' needs now, and that they reflect, to the extent possible, the evidence we see from research and the education landscape. So they were first published in 1994. They were revised in 2001. They were revised again in 2011, and that's the cover you see there. So these are our current standards published in 2011. So we're sort of on a 10-year cycle. So we seek to strike the balance here between being current and addressing what we know are people's needs now as educators and as learners, and being enduring over time. And as we think about that, we build on those original standards and what we knew in 1994 and what we knew in 2001. And so we stand on the shoulders of the 2011 standards as we revise these today. And Learning Forward recently celebrated its 50th anniversary a year ago. And so we build on that depth of knowledge as well. So there are the 7 standards. They have been adopted or adapted in policy in 35 states and are widely embraced in districts and systems across North America and the globe. And we know that educators use these 7 standards to understand, to plan, to provide resources for, to facilitate, and to evaluate professional learning. They work together as a system. You don't tease out one and say, well, we're more concerned about data than everything. They are an interlocking puzzle, and you work on all of them. That's always been true and will remain true in the revision. So as we look at the 7 up there, you will see ties to these when we look at the 10 that we're going to share a little bit later. But I just want to note that on the next slide, that the current revision is supported by 3 philanthropic funders. We appreciate so much that that they value this work and that they see the importance of revising standards. So thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York, to the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, and the Charles and Lynn Schusterman Family Foundation. And thanks, Jim, for being in the room with us today as our program officer. Okay. And now Paul is going to share a bit about the process we're going through and those folks we're collaborating with to do this work.
Great, thank you, Tracy. And again, we're excited that some of our Standards Advisory Council members are both certainly our panelists and also in this session as well, because we frankly couldn't have done this work without their expertise and feedback and guidance over really this last year of 2020, because this council is comprised of 25 individuals. And as you see from both this slide and the next slide, such a great mix of diverse and multiple perspectives at varying levels. So, for example, we have to give the shout out back to Linda again, who's not just Montana Teacher of the Year, but finalist for National Teacher of the Year 2020. So, that's the level we have on the council. And so that represents leadership at the classroom level, leadership at the principal and school level, right? Leadership at the district level, the state level, the national organizational level, the research university level, and certainly globally and international level. And that's where you can see is part of the council that we meet with regularly, as Denise mentioned in the beginning, to gather feedback, pose essential questions, and literally help draft these first set of revised standards. And also really embracing some difficult questions, right? We talked in the last session about getting our arms around hugging a cactus around equity. And I think, curriculum also brings with some areas that are important to grapple with and to think about high quality instructional materials and the connection to equity as well. And so we believe that this is a membership in the council that is uniquely positioned to help learning forward there. And so you can see both with the previous slide and this slide, just the range of experiences that are part of the council and the opportunities and how grateful we are to have them on board. They are part then of a structure where we again meet regularly, and we'll continue to meet in 2021 with the Standards Advisory Council. We also have 4 working groups, of which you'll hear in a moment from Elizabeth about the research team, comprised of a smaller group of individuals to go deeper with feedback, guidance, and assistance for that area, including research and evidence, including a writing and content development team that will be essential for the tool and implementation tool piece as we go into next year, a district, state, and province team to have an eye again around 2 areas, around ownership at those levels and around making sure policy and practice intersect well in the standards, in the revised standards, and making sure that we have their feedback at those levels of district, state, and province. And finally, we'll convene towards the end of the process, our review team, to make sure everything is set and that we are incorporating all of the feedback that we're gathering in since we just launched this first revised piece. So that's a very quick overview of the structure, but we wanted to make sure you knew who was there. And actually a complete list is in the release of the revised draft standards that just went out yesterday as well. So I want to turn over to Elizabeth to talk just briefly about the research team and also the research agenda for the advisory council. So Elizabeth.
Thanks, Paul. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being with us today. I'm excited to share with you the names of our standards research team. As Paul said, this is the first working team that has formed and met and been very active in informing the revision. The way these working teams are working is that they are informing the internal standards team as well as the Standards Advisory Council. And this team is critical because we want to ensure that the revised standards reflect the latest research as well as the latest evidence from the field. And so this team has been active and interested in providing us with recommendations, studies, papers, references, and some really challenging questions for us to wrestle with as a staff and with the Standards Advisory Council. And you'll see here that this team includes some experts in some names you probably recognize in relationship to the body of research around professional learning, as well as experts in learning sciences and in developing research practitioner partnerships. And so we love this group for their depth of expertise and experience, but also for the range of inputs and reviews they provide us. So in addition to the research team, we've also been receiving recommendations from about research from colleagues, from our consultants, from our affiliate leaders, friends, neighbors. Everyone has a study that we are eager to look at and really interested in, especially practitioners, school-based leaders, teachers, and coaches. We've been getting a lot of input to the research foundation from a range of people. So one of the building blocks in this foundation of updated research for the revised standards is a literature review that we have conducted in part, that AIR has conducted for us as part of this update. And our design here was to look at very tight parameters to really understand what randomized controlled trial studies can say about professional learning and the impact of particular interventions on observable teacher practice and improved student outcomes. So you'll see here that they analyzed 38 studies within those parameters. They referenced the findings against the framework of the 2011 standards and found evidence of the concepts in the 2011 standards in the research findings. They also found some key takeaways around content expertise, instructional materials, and coaching. So what they found in this literature review, which we're using as an internal guide, and we'll share some high-level findings from in the new year, are that there has, as you all probably understand, there have been advances in research related to these three key areas since 2011. So when we are working on the revision, we are looking at the 2011 standards, this literature review from AIR, as well as evidence from the field, and including other studies such as meta-analyses and individual intervention studies, so that we're representing a full range of evidence as we're considering the revision. Our next step with AIR is to, they'll be conducting a meta-analysis to look more in depth at the concepts that they found in the initial literature review. They're also adding about 20 to 25 studies that are less strict about the student outcome measure, so that it expands what we're looking at to include some more information about teaching practice. And we're excited about this. We're hopeful that at some point down the road, we'll be able to look at non-observable teacher outcomes. And that's part of the research agenda that's kind of developing for Learning Forward out of these first couple of pieces. I will point out that there are a couple of areas where the tightly scoped literature review did not reveal some evidence about emerging areas of interest that we know are an important part of the revised standards, such as equity and conditions for leadership. And some of this is related to the design of randomized controlled trial studies. There are often mentions of settings where people draw inferences about an equity priority, or draw inferences about the leadership and conditions that were required to implement a particular intervention, but they're not as explicit in the studies. And so that's something we're looking to address in our future research agenda, and we'll address in a paper we plan to release early in the new year. So that is sort of a very quick overview. In closing, I'll just say, as Paul and Tracy have both said, we welcome your input. So as you're looking at the revised draft standards, if there are studies you feel we would benefit from knowing about and reading, please send them along to us.
All right, thank you, Elizabeth. So just before we turn to our panel, I wanted to talk briefly about our rationale and sort of what we're thinking about, what we're looking at as we head into this revision. And as we think about what's happened in the last 10 years, we recognize that in the year 2020, we understand a lot more about what constitutes an effective professional learning system, and what does it take to create and support effective learning teams, and what do we know about meaningful professional learning leadership. And certainly we know so much more from research about the importance of high quality instructional materials and curriculum, which is what our panel will address today. And when we look at the fact that college and career ready standards came out about the same time that the 2011 standards came out, just think about what's happened in the field and what we know about the kinds of support that educators need to ensure every student has a rigorous, high quality learning experience. So when we look at just everything that's changed and we think about, okay, how is it that we create standards that can really support educator learning in this time? Those are all the areas we investigate. And so it's exciting that we'll dive into one of those key areas in just a couple minutes. And I will just sort of looking ahead say that this revision process will happen over a couple of years. We're actually just about finishing the first year now. And our goal is we will release final standards with implementation tools and with progress monitoring tools. And so you're seeing this at sort of it feels like an early part of this process. And the reason we're doing that is so that the standards as they evolve can inform the development of those implementation tools. If you know the standards, you are probably also equally a fan of the innovation configuration maps. So those kinds of implementation tools are what helps educators put standards into practice. So there will be a parallel effort. Yes, we must change policy at every level so that educators have both the pressure and support from policy and they have the resources they need. And at the same time, we need to support what kind of actions educators need to take. So that's why we will be releasing the full suite of tools at the same time in early 2022. So thank you for being part of this at this stage. And we're going to turn to our panel now. So I will be joined on the Zoom stage by 4 panelists. And I invite those who are not on the Zoom stage to turn off their cameras for now so that we can see the conversation, those who are doing the speaking. And we really would encourage your comments and questions in the chat box throughout the conversation. And we will work in conversation around that. So that will be very helpful. If you know the Zoom trick on your video settings, you can click the box that says hide non-video participants, and then your screen will be filled with those who still have their cameras on. So that's a good Zoom trick so that you don't see all the empty black boxes. So for now, I'm going to invite my panelists to join me on the stage. And we're going to first, everyone will introduce themselves. And the order we're going to go in is Eric Hirsch is going to kick us off. If you just introduce yourself, then we'll hear from Linda, Michelle, and Jim. And then we're going to kick off with your opening remarks.
I'm Eric Hirsch, the Executive Director of Ed Reports, which is a national nonprofit that with phenomenal educators reviews curriculum. And I know you're all thinking, not of relationship to E.D. Hirsch, and sadly not of relationship to Stephanie Hirsch.
All right, Linda.
Hello, I'm Linda Rost. I'm the 2020 Montana Teacher of the Year and top 4 national finalist. And I teach high school science in rural Baker, Montana, which is the southeast corner of Baker. I teach grades 10 through 12, biology and chemistry mostly. And I'm so excited to be here.
And I'll just note that Linda is in her classroom and she's doing what great teachers do. And she's juggling, I don't know how many dishes at once. So thanks for having us be one of the plates that you keep spinning in the air. We really appreciate it. Michelle.
Hi, I'm Michelle Elia, and I'm one of 2 Ohio literacy leads for the Ohio Department of Education. And I basically travel the state, though now virtually, presenting on the evidence-based language and literacy practices that we refer to as the science of reading to help districts implement changes in their literacy instruction to improve student outcomes.
Thanks, Michelle. Jim.
I'm Jim Short. I'm a director in the education program at Carnegie Corporation of New York. which is Andrew Carnegie's grant-making foundation. I manage a portfolio of organizations focused on the implementation of ELA math and science standards through the implementation of high-quality instructional materials with a real interest in what curriculum-based professional learning looks like, which is the relevance to this conversation today. As Tracy said, Carnegie is one of the funders of supporting the revised standards for professional learning. And I'm looking forward to hearing your feedback about how those new standards are shaping up and what you think. So glad to be here.
Thanks, Jim. All right, Eric has a particular skill in framing a conversation, so let's kick us off.
I think thanks for that, Tracy. I don't know if you're setting me up for success or failure with that, but I will do my best to rise to the challenge. I hope as we start to get into some phenomenal guidance, in particular from Linda at the classroom level, thinking about professional learning and all of the great work Michelle has done and Jim as well. Thinking about professional learning, I want to come and think about the curriculum / instructional materials aspect. And I want to bring up 3 things that may inform your thinking as the other panelists go. First and foremost, that materials matter, that the curriculum that you choose has a direct impact on student efficacy and student learning. This shouldn't be surprising, given that when we think about Elmore and the instructional core, we're really talking about a teacher, a student, and content. And the way that content is conveyed, both indirectly and directly through materials, makes a difference in how kids get that content. There are numerous studies that show the connection between curriculum and student learning, many of which you will see in the AIR studies, many of which, and Paul will be putting in a few links to infographics and links on our website that have a host of citations that talk about the impact of instructional materials as being as great as the quality of the teacher in the classroom, as reforms like class size reduction and the like. Unfortunately, there are a lot of challenges in getting these great materials into teachers' hands. First off, curriculum hasn't always been that great. I think that EdReports was founded in 2014, and I think that the last standards were written in 2011. Many of you have seen a lot of writing and on social media about a curriculum renaissance, that curriculum are so much better now than they were, and I'll talk about that in a second. But because curriculum has often not been standards aligned and of the quality that great teachers need, teachers have gone off on their own to create their own materials. Teachers on average spend 7 to 12 hours looking across the internet for their own materials because they haven't been provided materials that are strong enough, not only to get kids college and career ready, but to bear the weight of great professional learning. And unfortunately, those 7 to 12 hours are spent going to non-curated sites. As you start to look at some of those sites, like Teachers Pay Teachers, Share My Lesson, unfortunately, they found about 2/3 of the materials across those sites are not well aligned to standards. And let me say this, 96% of them have little to no supports for taking that lesson and supporting diverse learners. Not surprisingly, that hits on equity across classrooms, within classrooms, and despite the best of intentions, so many teachers without those supports end up teaching off grade level. And hopefully you've all seen the opportunity myth from a few years ago, which found roughly 3/4 of assignments in core curriculum areas in a given year are actually off of grade level. So we know the materials matter, both on their direct impact on how students get content. The issue is not all of the materials you will find, not just online, but in many of the scoped and sequenced curricular options that serve as the spine for instruction are created equal. So we've published about 800 grade and course level reports here at EdReports using great educators to look first and foremost at standards alignment. So in math, we're looking at focus and coherence. Only if it's the right math at the right doses at the right time will we go in and look at the rigor and the mathematical practices before discussing usability, because too often in adoptions, we focused only on usability. In ELA, and Michelle will talk a lot more about this, we're looking not just at whether the standards are in place in reading and writing and speaking and listening, but we're looking at what kids are reading, if they're getting questions that are text dependent and really engage kids in those materials. And we're also looking at if those readings build knowledge over time to really enhance children's vocabulary and get them college and career ready. And in science, we're looking at three-dimensionality, and we're looking at if it's phenomena driven, and whether all of those SEPs, science and engineering practices, cross-cutting concepts, and the like are all there. So unfortunately, we found only about 40% of the math materials that we've reviewed are fully standards aligned, and about half of the LA materials. But when it gets to actually using them at least once per week, only about 16% of teachers use a standards aligned curriculum once a week or more, and only about a quarter of math teachers. I'm not even talking about science. I'm going to leave that to Linda and Jim, because as of right now, we've only published one review of science materials that have fully met our alignment criteria to NGSS standards. So let me get to the third and last point. So not just that materials matter, not just that they're not all created equally, but to get the full effect of strong material and professional learning, how you choose and how you support matter a lot. Ultimately, we found, I'm glad you have Heather Hill on that research convening group, because ultimately her research has found that professional learning alone, curriculum alone, do not work as well and get the same sort of effect sizes as curriculum-specific professional learning together. And ultimately, what we find is the amount of professional learning that's provided that is curriculum specific is nowhere near enough to think about how to implement materials together. And so there was actually a recent study by Tom Kane that found that actually materials didn't have the student efficacy impacts. And they were saying, my gosh, this is antithetical to so much of what we know about the research. So they dug a little deeper, because they also surveyed teachers. And what they found is teachers received, on average in the study across 8 states, thousands of teachers, 1.1 days of professional learning that could even remotely be tied to the curriculum that was adopted and selected in the district in a year. And over the whole course of materials usage, which is often about 7 years, it was about 3 days. So there's so much more to do around linking professional learning and materials. And there are so many better panelists to talk about that than me. So back to you, Tracy and or Michelle.
All right, Michelle.
Okay, that's, Eric, you do make it very challenging to follow you. I'm just saying, but I will do my best. As Eric mentioned, my perspective, my input is going to be based and grounded in evidence-based language and literacy practices. So I'm really going to kind of frame both curriculum and professional learning from the basis of the science of reading. So curriculum-based professional learning, it's absolutely critical in teaching students to read, as this ensures that educators know the process of how to teach students, but also have access to these high quality instructional materials to do so effectively. And I say this because we know from neuroscience, and I'm going to quote Stanislaw Dehaene here, it's simply not true that there's hundreds of ways of learning to read. When it comes to reading, we all have roughly the same brain that imposes the same constraints and the same learning sequence. So really, it's about having professional learning and how to ensure students learn how to read, how to do so very deeply, but then also having materials to provide this instruction. So for clarification, curriculum, which includes those instructional materials, but also assessments, pacing guides, lesson planning tools, and these other supplemental materials, when well created, provide the what and the how for how students first learning to read. And then the combined professional learning then provides this background, the research base, the why we are using these materials, but also further provides the how, the instructional pedagogy that goes with it. But professional learning without access to these resources to implement it really won't change student outcomes. And unfortunately, I've seen this happen in Ohio in districts that have implemented some wonderful professional learning in structured literacy or the science of reading, but then they don't have the materials to go with it. And then without access to these materials, precious educator time is taken trying to create or curate these materials. And so going back to what Eric mentioned about, spending all of these hours trying to go online to find materials. And that leaves little opportunity to implement what they've learned well. So for example, I'll give you a practical example here. When teaching foundational skills or decoding skills, such as phonics, educators need a scope and sequence. They need an explicit instructional routine that includes dictation and blending. They need access to decodable text. They need routines that have the gradual release, right? So for explicit instruction. But they also need collaborative professional development on how and why to use these materials appropriately. Just putting the materials in the hands of educators on its own is not sufficient. So additionally, all students, including students who are struggling readers, and that includes obviously our students with disabilities, but all struggling readers, require and deserve access to grade level rigorous texts. The draft standards specifically call this out, and it's something that I'm really passionate about and probably sometimes become a little hoarse from reiterating so much. But students who struggle with reading fall further and further behind, not because of their reading difficulties, but because of their lack of exposure to an instruction with grade level content. And this isn't a new phenomena. We in fact refer to it as the Matthew effect. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Keith Stanovich coined that phrase when it came to struggling readers. When struggling readers are given simple, low-level materials, it significantly limits their knowledge base and exposure to complex vocabulary, complex sentence structure, and again, I'm going to say it twice because it's so important, that background knowledge. This information, this access is so critical for comprehension, but struggling readers are not really provided opportunities to engage with and grapple with and struggle with complex language and knowledge. And then as educators, we wonder why they can't comprehend the grade level texts and their high stakes assessments. Conversely, educators can't simply place students with grade level texts and then just say, oh, they'll learn it, they'll understand it. We can't just put materials into the hands of students. We actually need this professional learning to know how to scaffold the instruction so that our students can access this grade level material. So we might have to have professional learning in combination with the high quality materials. So we know how to pre-teach the vocabulary explicitly, teach the sentence structure, build a knowledge base through the use of stair-step texts and text sets. So both learning to decode and building this language comprehension, as far as I'm concerned, are really issues of equity. There are means of mitigating the Matthew effect. If struggling students are only engaging with below grade level materials, they'll fall further and further behind. And unfortunately, we've seen it happen time and time again. This happens, unfortunately, as well in districts of poverty, districts with large populations of marginalized subgroups of students. With high quality instructional materials, combined with that professional learning, now we can include these. We know why, we know how, and we have the materials for grade level instruction with explicit instructional routines to use with all of our students. So I know I've sounded a little preachy on this, but I'll kind of close out my time just by saying curriculum-based professional learning, it's absolutely critical for all students to learn to read. It helps us with our selection of materials as a district. I get a lot of questions statewide on what's the best instructional materials to use to teach students to read, but then also to make sure that they can comprehend what they're reading. This varies based on grade level. So we need to provide some professional learning on how to select materials, right, for our core instruction. But we also want to be sure that we free up educators not to have to design curriculum, but instead make instructional changes to the great materials they have so they can scaffold it so that all of our students can have access to these materials. And for me, that's a huge component of all of this. Okay, I think I've talked long enough. I'll turn it over to Linda next, who's going to really connect this not to literacy, but to science.
Thank you both so much. I want to give you both like a standing ovation because that was right on. And I'm going to speak from a practitioner, like classroom teacher. I've been teaching 14 years, but I've also been teaching in a rural location. And so my first 7 years, I was the only science teacher in the building and had no access to any teachers to collaborate with. And then also I didn't come from a teaching background. I had a science degree, and then I came into teaching and had to get certified after that. So I had kind of a different perspective and did not have access. The only resources I had access to were the internet and then a filing cabinet full of lessons and no teaching experience. So one thing that I would say with what Eric was talking about was, in addition to Teachers Pay Teachers and all of those other sites, there is actually like an underground huge like well of lessons that teachers have developed that we share on Facebook. So we have Facebook groups with, like, I'm in one that literally has hundreds of thousands of biology teachers, and we have a huge Google Drive where we all share our lessons and use them and we collaborate. And so those have been vetted by us, but they haven't been aligned to standards unless it's like AP biology, and those have. Which I'm in that also. So that also exists, and they have not been, aligned to anything. And I think many teachers use those more than any other formal curriculum probably. But I wanted to talk about my journey through professional learning and how I started in curriculum. So I started just with science curriculum. I started in a program in Montana where they were training us on the next generation science standards before they were even finalized nationally. So in about 2013, right around that time, and then before they were adopted in Montana, we continued the work. So we started with curriculum-based professional development. We were looking at the disciplinary core ideas mostly, and then also the practices. And we would go to workshops in person. We met together regionally across the state. We did stuff online too. We had online classes. And we were just learning about different lessons that had been published and trying them with our students. So we were just using that kind of instructional material that was given to us and reflecting on it and vetting it. And then the next year I was a trainer for that program, and we brought in the cross-cutting concepts, which is like another part of next generation science standards to make the lessons 3D. And at that point I was getting some individualized training. So we had to take our whole curriculum that was existing and we had to align it with all the standards. Every single lesson and lab, we had to look at what practices were used, what DCI was used, what cross-cutting concept, and we had to have it checked by our coach. And it took me a whole year to go through one class. I teach 4 classes, so it took me a year to go through one class. I have this huge spreadsheet, and that experience was really valuable, that I had help and coaching going through that. And the thing that shifted was they helped me to find lessons. Like if I was missing something, they helped me to find or shift my lessons so that it was aligned. And then after that, I began training other teachers. And so the next year they paid us to actually develop lessons that were 3-dimensional. And then we presented them at workshops and we vetted them in our classroom. So I've been able to design like 6 units from that. But one thing that we were talking about with Eric before and with Jim is that we need to make sure that these are aligned, and for teachers to have to, like, I had 3 years of training to do that. So for teachers to be able to do that on their own is a big ask, but teachers should have access to really high quality instructional materials and know how they're aligned and just have that professional learning to not only know how they're aligned, but also dig down to how the student is learning and how they're connecting with the content and the skills that they're learning, kind of at a deeper level, and to be reflective and reflexive of that process and the process that the students are going through in their learning. And it's not just what it looks like on the surface. Like I'm definitely a where does the rubber hit the road kind of person. Like it's not just this paper that you give us or this book you give us, it's what is happening in the mind of that student, of every student individually. That's the part that teachers need to be able to be equipped to like process that and reflect on it and then actually shift and adapt with different students. So that's my perspective, and I'll hand it over to Jim now.
Thanks, Linda. So Michelle commented about having to talk after Eric finished. Well, I've got to talk after all three of you have talked and presented, and hopefully can do a little bit maybe to bring some of these ideas together about high quality curriculum, the need for good coaching, good for materials, and role of professional learning. First, I just want to acknowledge the impact that the previous standards for professional learning by Learning Forward have had and the role that it's had in guiding policy and practice for over a decade. We're real excited, or I'm real excited, that the revised standards include content, specifically the role of curriculum instruction and assessment in professional learning. Given that particularly what we all know now about what it takes to implement college and career standards in ELA, math, and science. I've been at the corporation for about 4.5 years. I've been involved in science education for over 30 years. In the first 10 years, I was a high school biology teacher, similar to Linda. And at that time used what we referred to as inquiry-based, research-based instructional materials from the very first year I was teaching, and got to go to a workshop led by one of the authors of the curriculum from BSCS. That's been, an organization that's been around since Sputnik, creating better, more inquiry-based materials. So using high quality instructional materials and thinking about what professional learning around high quality instructional materials looks like has been a cornerstone of my work, as both as a teacher and a professional learning provider, and now as a funder. I want to come back to what Eric was saying about Elmore's Instructional Core, because we come back to this a lot in terms of a frame for thinking about this. And so when you think about a three-legged stool, and the seat of the stool being we want to improve student learning at scale. And scale is important here because what Linda was talking about is her journey as a teacher and the time it took for her to develop the expertise around the standards and around instructional materials is rather unique. We know from the data that Eric was sharing that that's not the experience of most teachers. And so if we're going to do this at scale, we really have to think about then what are the strategies that will lead to scale. And what Elmore talks about is when we change the content, meaning we change the standards like we did with college and career standards, or we change the assessments that the states give, then we have to do something to the other two legs of the stool, or the seat is unbalanced. And so when we think about improving the knowledge and skills of teachers, we think about professional learning. When we think about in changing the level of engagement by students, one of the ways to do that is with the instructional materials that a teacher is working with. So you don't have to spend all those hours Eric was talking about, or all that time Linda was talking about, focused on finding what am I going to do in the classroom, but you have better materials to work with that help with the what I'm supposed to teach, as well as the how I'm supposed to teach, which is what Michelle was talking about. I think often a lot of my work before the foundation has always been grounded in curriculum reform and professional learning. And we think about kind of like what a colleague of mine refers to as the 4 Ps of curriculum reform. We think about what's the purpose, we have a clear vision with goals and priorities about what college and career preparation looks like. And those lead to policies. And we've been very successful, I think, as a country, having states adopt new standards and frameworks that don't all get called the same thing in all of our states around the country, but they're all moving in the same direction, whether it's Common Core literacy and math, or some derivative of that, or the next generation science standards, or the framework from the National Research Council, or something aligned with that. But now what we have to shift to are thinking about what are the programs, meaning the actual instructional materials or the professional learning programs, that then are going to lead to then helping improve practice, or changing the teaching strategies that teachers use. And that takes a lot longer than creating a vision and creating policies. And so we have to be, in this for the long haul. There's been lots of research around what quality professional learning looks like, and Learning Forward is drawing heavily on that research. We also have a lot of research on what high quality instructional materials, or what some of the people refer to as educative instructional materials, looks like. So the question now is, that's pertinent to this conversation, is what does it look like when you do curriculum-based professional learning? What I think is most teachers have never experienced the sort of inquiry-based learning that we expect them to provide for their students. So how can I teach these new standards, work with these new materials if it's not how I ever learned myself. And so we need to give teachers the chance to be learners and experience that, as well as the support to plan for that kind of instruction. So over the last year at the foundation, we've been studying a diverse mix of schools and districts, all of which who are successfully using new curricula in partnership with many of our grantees. We did in-depth a review of the research base, as well as a convening about a year ago of curriculum developers and organizations that support teacher learning. And we identified a core set of actions or approaches and enabling conditions for curriculum-based professional learning. So a couple of weeks ago, we released a challenge paper, a report called The Elements for Transforming Teaching Through Curriculum-Based Professional Learning. And 10 of these elements are referred to as design features, like thinking about the standards for professional learning provide a framework, but how could you go a little more specific in the guidance for actually designing professional learning programs when they're specifically around the implementation of curriculum. In addition to the 10 elements, we also have 3 essentials, which are the foundational conditions that system leaders must establish in order for curriculum-based professional learning to thrive. Included in the report are also several stories from the field that illustrate what these elements and essentials look like in action. And I think that's critical because Learning Forward's doing the same thing with the professional learning standards, been putting vignettes or images of like, what does these different standards look like, and the other tools that Tracy talked about, the implementation tools that'll be coming out later with the standards are also part of that. One of the areas of the functional design, or one of the areas of elements that we had defined are what we call functional design features. And I think, because this is a challenge paper, we're trying to, nudge the field a little bit about, so what does it look like to do curriculum-based professional learning? What are some of the things designers and facilitators of professional learning have to think about? And we do think that teachers deserve the opportunity to experience instruction as their students will. So that means they need to be a learner using the same instructional materials that they're going to use with their students in professional learning. So I would say that's different than a typical training session around curriculum. And then work with other teachers. They're going to also use the same high quality instructional materials to help plan for instruction and come back and later reflect on instruction. Those cycles of inquiry that we know are powerful strategies for professional learning. At the end of the report, there's a call to action for the field, and we actually have some recommendations for what teachers need to do, what coaches and professional learning providers need to do, and what schools and systems need to do. So again, I think it sets as a nice complement to the revised standards for professional learning when one thinks about how to do curriculum-based professional learning. What does professional learning look like that's aligned and supportive of the implementation of high-quality instructional materials? Thank you.
All right, thank you, Jim. Thank you, Linda, Michelle, and Eric. I appreciate hearing your comments. And Jim, we've popped a link to the elements paper in the chat box a couple of times and appreciate seeing that so much. And it's so this challenge paper comes out at a time when we're in development on the standards, and we're very much it sort of feels like a relay, not a race so much, but as we work toward building a full suite of tools to help folks deeply understand high quality professional learning and what it looks like when paired with high quality curriculum and instructional materials, to have your paper out there informing the standards, and then having that as a tool that folks can use as they go deeper is just a great match for us. And I know that as both of our suites of resources develop, will be a powerful combination. So it's wonderful to have that piece out there, and Learning Forward was pleased to be able to contribute to it as well. So, okay, now I'd really just love for the 4 of you to have a conversation together. And I see a lot of points of intersection, and then of course the different perspectives you all have, and really fascinated just to think about, and I know that we'll hear some more questions in the chat box, but you know, for some folks, this is a new question, and they have an orientation toward instruction that is what Linda has experienced over her career. And I'm sure what Michelle experienced in hers, and, you know, everybody else, Jim, that's how you talked about it. And so as folks make an orientation, and I'm just putting this question out there because it's sort of the first thing you hear for folks who aren't deeply immersed in the research is, well, that's taking away teacher autonomy, that's taking away teacher creativity, and that's where I have my opportunity to apply what I understand about my students. And I just wonder, what's your first response when you're talking to folks about that? Michelle, I'm going to invite you to start.
Okay. I think that the autonomy and the creativity, especially when, as I work with teachers, comes in the approach to the practices. More the activities that they're doing. So we know that there are evidence-based practices. We know that we need, in addition to this, high-quality instructional materials that, for me, are grounded in grade level texts, building knowledge, high quality vocabulary, and then obviously teaching students how to read and how to decode. But the creativity comes in those individual activities that we're doing when we utilize some of those materials, and the how we differentiate and scaffold to meet the specific needs of our students. And so I think, Tim Shanahan spoke to this at one point where he said, we want to put teachers back in the mix. When we use really low quality materials, sometimes we're taking teachers out of the mix because, are not low quality, low level materials. They don't really have to think about how to help students access them because they're such low level, right? But when we give students very high level, rigorous grade level materials, now we've got to really kind of think about how we're going to scaffold that. Am I going to pre-teach this vocabulary word, or and how am I going to do that? Am I going to focus on this sentence or this sentence to really break it down and help them understand sentence structure? So the creativity is in my instructional approaches, grounded in evidence-based practices, but my approach can be varied a lot. And that's based on what my students and what I know about them. So there's a lot of creativity in that.
I think we're in part constrained by a history of curriculum being used to deprofessionalize teaching in some sense. And I even go back to not even a decade ago with these first standards and a lot of conversation about teacher evaluation and teacher effectiveness, and thinking that curriculum might be used. Every time we say curriculum, I always assume that a teacher hears scripted right before I say it. And it gets to something we talk a lot about when we work with districts and states to understand our reviews and utilize as they select. And it gets to implementing with integrity versus implementing with fidelity. Fidelity starts to feel like handcuffs and shackles meant to pace teachers day to day to constrain variation to get everybody above a floor. Curriculum with fidelity is about giving teachers the tools they need to be empowered to do exactly what Michelle just said and start to scaffold, customize, bring in supplemental material, but keep that skeletal spine, which is so important as Jim talked about scalability. If we're going to get to equity and true professional learning, not across PLCs, across schools, et cetera, having 3 million different ways to get to the curricular piece isn't going to cut it. So I think we need to be much more attuned to this notion of integrity, and that means engaging teachers in the selection of the materials, the adoption, really how you're going to implement, thinking about the knowledge, the data of student learning, and to think about how to use the curriculum to advance student learning and not get caught in language from prior times that may have seen curriculum thought of and potentially utilized differently.
Thank you, Eric. Linda?
I've never used a scripted lesson, but I've seen them, and it makes my blood curdle for sure. But I understand the role of them because I have read them, not while I was delivering them. I've read them to prepare to understand the lesson, and then I did it my own way for my own students. So I can understand the role of them, but I definitely do agree that those types of materials can be very limiting to teachers because we think we have to use them in that way and we think we have to follow them exactly like they are. And I think that teachers need to be given permission to use that as a tool, but to step outside that and serve our students. And I think one area that we can do that the best is like you were saying, Eric, we can use the lesson as like a framework and the bones of it, but then we can bring in like other cultural or, you know, local perspectives. We can also use that as a framework and then bring in like another topic. And if it's a really great unit and a really great framework, we can use that for a lot of different things. But I have definitely seen, I mean, I can think of even in my building, the ways that teachers have been limited by the curriculum that they're given. And I don't know how to convey that in professional learning, but we really need to step outside of that because it's harmful. It's harmful to our students. It's not the way that the lessons were supposed to be given. I think a lot of those were, and in fact, some of the scripted lessons I would say don't even sound like they were written by a classroom teacher. Like some of the things that they tell the teacher to do, I can't even, and maybe it's just me and how I teach, but I can't even imagine doing some of those things. And so the perspective kind of feels like somebody's sitting behind their computer typing, but not actually being a teacher. And that's hard. That's hard to implement well when that's what we're given to work with. So.
Yeah, I think there is a shift here. I know when I went through my teacher preparation program a long time ago, you were left kind of with the impression that the teacher is the curriculum developer, and you would even create units and lessons and stuff, you know, in courses. And standards have changed a lot over the last couple of decades. So therefore, the what we're asking teachers to do has gotten a lot more complicated. And just as other professionals in the field, I don't want to go to a doctor who diagnoses me and then goes in the back room, comes back out a few minutes later and says, here's something I read about online last night that I've heard a whole bunch of other people said would be really cool to try and do. And I want you to go home and try it and see if it make you feel better. And if it doesn't, don't worry, there's a bunch of other suggestions that people had too, so we can try some other things. I want to, state of the art techniques, medicines, treatments, and so forth. And I feel like teachers deserve the same thing. So maybe instead of being the designer of the curriculum, you're the implementer of the curriculum. And so and another way of thinking about it is teachers need to be more like learning engineers. They need to know about the process of how kids learn. They need to know their kids and have relationships with them, but they need to know their content really well. They know how to teach kids that content. And when I go back to my first couple of years of teaching, I had a degree in biology. I had a master's in science education. I knew something about teaching, and I knew something about the content. But if you ask me how I learned to teach biology, it was with the instructional materials, which some people would say, well, that's a textbook. And then they look at the teacher materials, which are even thicker than the student materials, and go, oh, that's scripted. And I never viewed it as a script, because what it did is it helped me prepare as a teacher, because it gave me ideas about what my kids might say when they were going to do this activity, or some misconceptions the kids might have, and help me maybe not try to fix it right then, because it was going to come up later in the instructional sequence. And so I think when Eric talks about, teaching with some integrity and not necessarily fidelity, we know from the implementation research that just following it as a recipe does not lead to good teacher practices, and definitely not the kind of student learning potential we see. But it is important for teachers to understand the intent of what the curriculum is trying to do. And that may mean kind of living with some ambiguity and trusting the process until they sort of see the arc of instruction, the coherence of the instructional sequence, how the different activities fit together, because it may be different than the way a teacher has been teaching with their own materials, but there may be something there to learn. But you're still the one that's going to have to implement it and make it work with their students. So during the 10 years I taught, I worked with BSCS biology materials every year, but it was different because my kids were different, but I was still working with the same materials in terms of what if you ask me how to teach a topic in biology, that's what I refer back to in terms of how I learned to teach that topic in those instructional materials.
All right. Thank you. And I want to jump to a question we had in the chat box from Stephanie Hirsch, actually. just as you all talked about, you referenced the importance of coherence in curriculum and professional learning. And when you look at draft standards and think about the various points we touch on, how does that fit in application of the revised standards? How do you see that coming out, and what would implications even be for how we continue to revise and improve them? What do you need to see in the standards for this kind of coherence of implementation of curriculum materials?
Well, I'll jump in here right at the beginning just to say that when we were working on the elements, the standards were being done at the same time. So like as Tracy was saying, there's an opportunity now to kind of see how they fit together. But when I first saw the draft of the standards and had these ideas of what these elements that would kind of guide the development of programs, there was tons of overlap. There wasn't anything that we weren't thinking about that the standards wasn't saying the same thing. And so I think one of the important things is to not just describe standards as sets of individual statements, but how the standards link with each other. Because when you go to implement them, just like when you go to implement content standards in science or literacy or math, it's a bundle of things that you're working on with students during a unit. It's not like you're doing a standard at a time in teaching. And I think the same is true in professional learning. It's a bundle of things. And so the innovation configuration maps and other tools, we hope that the elements will help people think about how to integrate several of these ideas together in the design of their professional learning programs. Because I think that's what makes it more coherent than to think of it as separate things, but how it's more tied together. So that's why I think professional learning around curriculum is so critical, because it's what teachers use with their students every day in the classroom. So my bias would be most of your professional learning should be around the curriculum, because that's what teachers do most of the time with students is around that.
I agree. I think that we should have training where we look at the curriculum kind of globally, like this is all of it. And then we have opportunities to piece it out. And we've also been working in our district with having curriculum alignment between grade levels and even subject areas to find some of those commonalities. But that's like that's like a 10-year project, right? Like that's for a whole district. That's a lot of work. And we've just started conversations about it, but we need to be able to see it all, the whole thing together, how it all weaves together. And we can, like teachers know that. We already know that, we already do the things that Jim was just saying, but we need like training and time and guidance and coaching in that so that we can actually make sense of it all and then actually put it to work.
And I want to bring up Danny Medved had a question about the role of assessment in all of this. And I think that question really kind of reflects this interweaving that Jim was talking about within these standards for professional learning. Because as we look at our assessment data, that's going to kind of give us information as to how well we're doing in terms of our core instruction. And so that kind of supports that idea of this culture of collaborative inquiry, right? We're looking at continuous improvement. We're focusing on the student data. We're looking at this data through these, through quality assessments and saying, okay, 80% of our students are not proficient. So we know that we have to go back and look at core instruction in terms of what we're teaching and the quality of that instruction, which is influenced by the professional learning the educators are receiving. So, that's kind of really brings in other components of the standards. And we've already talked about how equity is so impacted by high quality instructional materials. Ensuring that all students have access to grade level content is a huge equity piece. So there really is this wonderful relationship within the standards that curriculum plays within all of it. There's this back and forth. So.
Right. And I just want to come back to not just the coherence across the standards of professional learning, but coherence within the curriculum, and back to this notion of integrity and use of data, right? Oh my gosh, what a great time to be having this conversation about how are we going to deal with learning loss and unfinished learning, but yet listen to what Michelle really emphasized around grade level texts and grade level standards. How are we going to assess it? And then how are we going to adapt our instruction to still do grade level standards, but not just teach over it? And that gets to the whole notion of professional learning around content And this notion of coherence, even within a curriculum, part of the problem of teachers being curriculum developers, that as Jim said, none of us were prepared to really do this well in teacher prep, but the notion of getting it right 150 times in a row, and that your 150 lessons will come together into a grade level coherent whole, it's impossible. Yet I'll take the math side because we have so much ELA and science expertise. We know a lot about focus, learning progressions for kids. Not all of these standards are created equal. And if we're going to get kids to algebra, we got to start fractions in third grade. And if we're going to get to fractions, we need to spend more time on those. So how are we going to adapt? That's not just about the content, it's how will we adapt the curriculum, how will we assess, how will we learn, and how will we as teachers come together with the materials to empower us to then say, oh, we're not just going to barrel ahead with kids, but we're going to then think about different ways of conveying content, grouping kids, and good materials help teachers think about these things. They don't just give you a lesson in a textbook anymore. If that's what y'all think, you haven't looked at some of the newer standards aligned material in math and ELA and emerging in science.
Well, and I just want to put a name to what Eric's talking about, and it's what the research literature calls educative instructional materials. So we know that instructional materials are supposed to teach kids, but the more innovative, more contemporary, high quality instructional materials provide a lot of support for the teacher for how to teach that content. And we're not talking about a textbook with a teacher's edition that's a wraparound TE with little tips and tricks in the margin. We're talking about more in-depth information. So I think that's, again, going back to what we said before about scripted. It's not about just do this, do this, do this, do this, and this is like how to do the lesson. It's how do we provide more support for the teacher to work with the materials, because professional learning is always going to be limited. And so therefore, when the teacher's back home, preparing for the next week, preparing for the next day, what's in the instructional materials to help build on that professional learning, to help them with the planning. And so many times the teacher's materials, the teacher-facing materials in these kind of curriculum is much more extensive than what many people have experienced by just seeing like a teacher's edition of a standard textbook.
I had one more thought that Jim just reminded me of that he spoke of earlier, and that was about teachers learning how to teach inquiry, especially in science. Most teachers, including myself, have never learned in that way, except for the stuff my dad did with me because he's a scientist, like at home. That was the best science instruction I ever had, but the stuff in school, we don't learn that way. And so the way that professional learning should look for teaching that practice, like in those skills, teachers should be doing the lessons just like a student would. And also having time to reflect on the pedagogy and looking at grade levels and things like that, but we should be doing those lessons just as if we were students, and the facilitator can just teach just like they're teaching students. That's how we learn how valuable it is to be in that same learning space as a student and feel what it feels like to look at a phenomenon and wonder about things and not know the answer. And so I think that part of professional learning, at least for science, is really important. I don't know if that's important for other subject areas, but yeah, so I definitely agree with that piece.
And I'm thinking back to, I'm sorry, Jim, you want to comment on that?
I just want to put a footnote to what Linda said. I really do think that that kind of inquiry-based instruction is relevant across disciplines, because when we talk about the kids needing to make meaning out of what they're doing and the level of discourse and the kids owning it, well, an inquiry stance works in ELA, math, science, social studies, history, because it's really putting the student in the driver's seat and the teacher more as a facilitator. So I agree. I associated originally with science, but I'm beginning to realize it's actually an approach that works across disciplines.
Okay, so many of the comments, and Eric, I'm thinking back to what you said about the profession and respecting teachers as professionals and how great materials really give them the tools they need to be their utmost as professionals. And then there are so many perceptions of the profession and perceptions of what curriculum and materials are that are not what we might hope they should be. And so when we think about great materials in the hands of teachers who've had an opportunity to experience this kind of professional learning become a wonderful equity lever, which is fantastic. So we can sort of follow that and, applaud that. Then when I think about, and we just came out of our equity session where we talked about that across standards, And what's the equity? There are also equity implications for systems that haven't yet either allocated the resources to purchase high quality materials, or they don't see the value, or it's a learning. There's so many different kinds of learning contexts where those resources may not be available. And, you know, so that becomes then an equity issue, not just for students, but for the professionals, for the entire education community. And I have a feeling Linda may understand this as well as anybody. And I just wonder, what is the role of something like our standards to push how we think about both the profession and what we provide to educators as well as to students to make sure that the entire engine is driving toward equity outcomes? And how can we help drive that? Because not everybody has bought into that yet.
I don't think I can answer that very well, but I can just say from my perspective that in my district, it's like every teacher's out for themselves, and we have to figure out how to access professional learning on our own. And it's expected that we just do that on our own. But that might be unique to a rural district too. So, but there's definitely equity issues in rural districts. So it's a problem.
Yeah, I'm glad you took the first whack at that, Linda. That is a hard question.
Yep.
I'm thinking of a couple things, right? As we talked about curriculum and the perception great teachers may have of curriculum because of the history of the way it was utilized and poor curriculum decades ago, that I think that is a mindset we need to shift. Another mindset we need to shift is teacher as martyr, and that you don't care about and love your kids, and you're not using something engaging if you haven't spent these 7 to 12 hours ultimately searching around the web and the world. So I think, as I think about some of the other standards, like what is the role of a principal in supporting teachers in aligning professional learning and some of the leadership competencies, they really come into play as we think about the resource standards and ensuring that we're purchasing material. We've been talking to a district that's one of the top 20 largest districts. They're moving ahead. They're in the second year of an ELA adoption because they've brought their community along with it. They've engaged their Black and Latinx communities to think about cultural competence indicators to build in addition to standards alignment, not in lieu of, in addition to. And this purchase, though, just for ELA, they're looking at a $20 million price tag. So we can't, materials are expensive. Publishers have to pay for copyrights of things for kids to read often. So we shouldn't presume it's free. That said, I do want to come back though, and Jim, this is a perfect segue over to you, that there are a lot of options we've reviewed that are open education resources. So cost shouldn't be it's essential that we pay for it, and we need to pay for professional learning and the materials, but there are still options and curriculum that are full open education resources that are fully standard aligned in math and ELA, at least at this point in time, that we've reviewed and are publicly available and out there. And I'm not advocating to use those in lieu of something else, but to say there are also places to go as you advocate towards your district to start to invest in the way that we should. And we need to start telling these districts that if you think materials are expensive in that $20 million price tag, why don't you cost out what 7 to 12 hours of a teacher costs every blessed week, and think about rolling that into actually looking at data and helping kids with instruction.
So those last few seconds you just said, I think we need that as a little video clip. Do you think those materials are expensive? So he was teeing it up for you, Jim.
Well, I do agree with what Eric is saying. And when I first got to the corporation, I knew that private philanthropy hadn't played a big role in curriculum. Most of those investments had been with like the National Science Foundation for a lot of math and science materials over the decades. And I think because of the investments that foundations made in helping get new standards established, there became a real interest in curriculum, because that's a natural way of like, how do you translate the standards into programs, into instructional materials? Because a lot of times that's then what then shifts teachers' practice once they try to try out those materials. And so investing in open education resources is an equity and access thing, because it gives all teachers access to high quality materials. When I worked in Denver public schools, I had teachers who had just never seen more inquiry-based materials, because all that had ever been put in front of them were traditional textbooks. And once they realized there were different kinds of materials out there that could support with the how to teach, not just the what to teach, they were really interested in that, because that was going to be less work for them to figure out how to make it engaging for kids. And instead they could figure out if any of these things need to be adapted to meet the needs of their kids, which is a different kind of work. So I do think we need to rethink about, we talk about professional learning. To me, the train the trainer model in professional learning is another equity and equity issue, because we send some teachers to professional learning to learn about a curriculum and then expect others to come back and share what they've learned. Well, it doesn't work. It doesn't work that way. All teachers deserve to be part of professional learning, particularly when the district has adopted a new set of instructional materials. We also find sometimes that people think, well, if you just put the data out and put the research out, it will convince people like this is, what you should use. Well, it doesn't work that way. Teachers have to, they're not going to change their beliefs just because someone tells them this is better. I've been teaching for a long time. I think I know what works for my kids. How do I know this is going to work with my kids? And so again, we go back to this stance around the teacher being given the chance to be the learner and to experience the curriculum themselves, and then try something with their students, see how it goes. The coaching and support that Michelle's been talking about is critical, so that we know that the teachers getting what they need to try to implement it. But once they see that it changes how their kids are learning, then they're going to get more interested to want to try more of it. And so I think only through that change of experience will then they maybe change their beliefs about what these curriculum materials or high quality instructional materials have to offer. So we have to think about that in terms of how professional learning is designed.
I love that point, Jim. And I think that you answered one of the questions that someone had in the chat box about, how does this impact professional learning providers? That taking these standards to help in the design of professional learning is so important. And you also, I almost wanted to say, or type in the chat that you were really just bringing in all of the components of the standards for professional learning. You were talking about learning designs. I mean, so beautifully integrating all of this. Teachers working with the curriculum as if they were the students is so important. And then the follow-up then would be the coaching after the fact to kind of extend that professional learning forward. But if only the coaches get the PD, then only the coaches have the opportunity to grapple with the content, and teachers are missing that. So I love how all of these standards for professional learning kind of work together.
All right, thank you. I wonder for each other, do you have a remaining question you want to put out there as we look at our last 5 minutes or so in this conversation?
There was one question about how to integrate different content areas with professional learning. And I think that kind of goes back to what Jim was saying about inquiry. I think, well, what we do in science is we actually look at how ELA and math are aligned. And so a lot of the professional learning that we do is we look at some of those overlaps when we're using lessons and implementing. So I think we actually have to intentionally look at those things. How are the practices the same? What are the overlaps? And then how can we design professional learning to show all of that together? And then maybe teachers will break down their classroom walls and actually work with other teachers in other classrooms and, work on cohesive units and things like that.
Well, to build on what Linda's talking about, science is not just one discipline, it's several disciplines. There's life science, physical science, earth and space. And so there's some challenge of how to integrate those in a coherent way instead of thinking of them as separate, complete disciplines. And that's a challenge for curriculum developers, because particularly in the high school, Earth and space science is not a typical course. It's always biology, chemistry, and physics. So how do you meet the challenge and rigor of all those standards? At the other end of the spectrum, when you think about elementary science, there's not a lot of time in the curriculum for elementary science. And so there's an enormous amount of time for teaching literacy and math. And so one of the things that I think science and other disciplines have to show is that, well, you're still going to do some reading. Michelle was talking about reading in the content area and building that content knowledge. You're still going to do writing. Maybe there'll be a different kind of writing because it's science writing, maybe a little more technical, descriptive. And you're going to do some computational thinking because of the role that math and data visualizations and things like that play. And so I think sometimes we don't do a good enough a job for developing curriculum that makes these kind of connections across. We just expect the teacher to be able to do it all. And so I think that's another challenge that these new standards, when next generation science standards are put together, every single science standards page has connections to ELA and literacy and Common Core. So for the first time, we have science and engineering and literacy and math all connected to each other in one blueprint. Well, that's very powerful. If you're a curriculum developer, it could be very overwhelming if you're the teacher standing in front of 25, 30, 35 kids and trying to figure out how to integrate and put all those things together. And so again, I think it's not taking away the teacher autonomy. It's really empowering the teacher to be able to do better for kids and with kids so that we can see dramatic changes in both their view of excitement around learning, but also of the achievement in learning, of what they're able to demonstrate and master that they understand and can apply.
And to your point, Jim, some of the best curriculum resources on Ed Reports really bring science and social studies standards into the literacy instruction, because so much time is devoted to the literacy block, as it should be at the elementary level. But why aren't we reading texts and being read aloud texts for science and social studies in units and themes to build that knowledge base from such a young age? So once again, great curriculum, and then the professional development on how to use it is going to be so critical. Those elementary grade bands, as kids are learning to read, we can use these wonderful texts to teach students to read too.
Yeah, I think that's such a strong point, Michelle. I mean, NGSS has math and ELA integrated within. ELA is explicit about math and science standards, and right, we want to build knowledge. We want kids reading a balance of fiction and nonfiction and having these great opportunities. I keep reflecting, Jim, I think we both bring gray hair to this session. I was on the 2001 standards revision committee because Stephanie has long emphasized my own professional learning for many decades. Thank you, Stephanie. I think about the standards in 2011. And I think, one, the standards themselves are so remarkably different now. We were just at the earliest stages of college and career ready standards, and NGSS wasn't there. And I think the materials were at a different place. It's not surprising that the 2011 standards didn't really emphasize instructional material in the same way we're talking about now. Standards are different, the materials are different. I think as we think, and there were a few questions about, well, should all PD be curriculum specific? I think we know from the research that is coming through that professional learning, it's necessary, but it may not be sufficient for hitting all of teachers' needs and learning pieces, SEL and the like. So no one's saying that there should not be additional professional learning opportunities, but saying that we want to use these newer, standards aligned, better materials as not only the tool, but the blueprint. Again, not just the elements, but how we combine those elements into a formula and have the professional learning to have people talk about it and utilize it and serve as a basis for our conversation. We're all ready, and the standards and the materials are now good enough to have this conversation. It wasn't in 2011. So thanks to you, Tracy, and your colleagues, I think we're ready now.
Well, that's fantastic to hear. And just, you're absolutely right about being in a totally different position in 2011. For one thing, there were times where Learning Forward felt like we were standing in a corner in a very crowded auditoriums saying professional development matters, professional development matters. And for some folks, it took the release of college and career ready standards and a couple years of some arm flapping, and then people saying, yeah, professional development does matter, you know. And I think that really heightened for a lot of folks the importance of both professional development and high quality materials, that when you have really rigorous standards, it's not the only thing out there. It's got to come with the full system. So it's great that all these things are blooming together at this point, along with, you know, a greater clarity around equity, which is just perfect. So I want to thank the panel so much. We snap our fingers, and I know everybody applauds at the great expertise and the great questions you raised. This was just the right conversation for us and really helpful as we look at continuing to refine and revise the standards. So thank you, Linda, Michelle, Jim, and Eric. So appreciate that you had this conversation with us today. And so with that, I invite others to turn their cameras on as we finish up the session today. Come back into the room so we can see your faces if that's how you do it. And we're going to take a look at our draft of standards, and Paul's put the slides back up there. And I know that he will also share in just a little bit the URL if you don't have it handy to download standards. But I can tell from the chat box that many of you have taken the opportunity to take a peek at that initial PDF, and that's great. Just love to have you take a look at that and give your input and start to think about what it means for you. Okay, so as we look at the draft we put out there, you see the colorful blue, green, gold graphic we have there, which is the 10 standards in a frame of sort of the system of professional learning and how these standards work together. That's a circle. See how they all connect at the middle? They all touch each other. They all work together. And just to continue that bloom metaphor from a couple minutes ago and make this beautiful flower of the professional learning system. So the frame is conditions for success, where we look specifically at what's the context for learning. And you see 4 standards there. You see equity foundations, the culture of collaborative inquiry, leadership, and resources. And then the transformational processes, the green part of the system, that's really the how of professional learning. What does the learning look like? How do we design learning? And really, how do we design learning to match the content, which is in the gold portion? And that's a lot of what we talked about, what we heard from our panelists today about really the critical match between what you're learning and what your own learning as a professional needs to look like, so that you're mirroring what students experience and you're immersed in those kinds of content and learning experiences. And then in that orange gold frame, we have the 2 content standards: curriculum assessment and instruction, and reaching each student. So a couple things I'm going to point out here. You'll see an explicit equity standard in each area of the frame, because we can talk about, and here we're looking at the conditions for success. So within our conditions, we look at equity foundations. And what does it look like establishing a vision for professional learning that's equitable? We are aiming toward a vision, and we hope we get there really fast, where each student has an opportunity for rigorous learning with rigorous materials. And what does it mean for the educator's learning? What's their learning have to look like? And how does it touch every educator? So what's our vision for that? And what do we need to create at the system level? What do we need to create in schools so that every educator has that access? And then we also talk about the culture of collaborative inquiry. If you are familiar with previous standards, we've talked about learning communities for years. That collaborative learning is as important as ever, more important than ever. And learning communities has been a term we've used, and we also recognize that folks bring a lot of different meanings to the phrase learning communities. And we see this as a really high level culture. It's a view for the way work gets done. It's not just a learning design. When you have your maybe once a month PLC meeting, it's how you do all your work. And it's where we really embed the kind of learning that we're talking about today. It's what students are working on in the classroom. And so where are you thinking about those integrations between the unit you have coming up and what you're learning about SEL and what you're learning about how do you make sure that every student in your room, no matter their race, their culture, their gender, their background, that they are learning in really rigorous ways. And so that's where that culture of collaboration is so critical. And then we know leadership matters, and it doesn't just happen from those who have formal leadership titles and formal leadership responsibilities. It's all those who lead professional learning and who advocate for their own profession as we think about what the profession really should mean. And then resources. And I'm thinking about the ways that curriculum runs through all of these when we think about coherence. So Eric, you mentioned, it's a resources question, it's a leadership question, what's your vision? So you can see the curriculum material thread run through all of these, and you'll see that in draft standards as well. In resources, we write about how is it that you're making sure the professional learning that you're allocating funds to is around the high quality materials you've decided to allocate funds to, and where is it that you tear down those silos so that you really have coherence across the system. When we look at the transformational processes, we have an equity driver standard. And so that's where we look at the learning that educators do together. How do we make sure there's equity in the way folks have an opportunity to collaborate, that they have the capacity to collaborate with diverse colleagues? Evidence, as ever, is so critical in planning, designing, and monitoring and assessing the impact of professional learning. And then learning designs and implementation. So what does that learning really look like? We've talked about learning designs quite a bit. And then implementation in terms of how do we sustain learning over time? And how do we recognize that our learners are in different places when it comes to their readiness for change? And what does it really take to implement wide-scale change, like implementing a new curriculum? And then finally, our two content standards when we look at rigorous and inclusive content. So curriculum assessment and instruction, and that may be the place you start reading the standards first. You can start with any standard you want because you're in this room. I know you have an interest in curriculum. And then reaching each student, where we really have the opportunity to learn about how is it that we acknowledge and teach every student in our classes. How do we say, yes, these are assets all of our students bring, and this is how we can create a rich learning environment. So those are the 10 standards. And we'll just take a look at what the standards themselves for each of those, what they look like. So around each standard, we're looking at the culture of collaborative inquiry here on the screen, but there's the statement of the standard itself. And then we provide a narrative that goes deep on each of 3 concepts in the standards, helping you understand what that means and what the implications are for professional learning, along with reference citations and resources. And then we list a series of essential actions. So when we think about moving the standard into implementation, and what are the actions that educators take to make that standard come to life? So this list is not comprehensive, but it does touch the high points of what educators across roles do. And as we wrote these standards, many of the sentences start with educators do this, educators build capacity for this, educators explore this. And so it's really an educator in any role. We know that depending on your role in a system, you may have different responsibilities toward professional learning, but everybody has responsibilities toward professional learning across all these standards. So once we get into implementation guides, we'll get a lot more into role-specific responsibilities, but when we really think about educators' responsibilities for their peers, for themselves, for the systems they support. That's why we really put the educators in the driver's seat in these standards. So those are the essential actions. And then for each, we also include a vignette to show what the standard looks like in action. And we're portraying a learning journey there in every case. And we've showcased many different learning contexts, content areas, levels of the system. And what does it look like when this particular standard is highlighted, and at the same time recognizing that the whole body of standards works together all the time. So even in this culture of collaborative inquiry, you'll see the role of leadership, and you'll see the role of resources, and you'll see the role of curriculum assessment and instruction. So that's just a quick introduction to what you're going to see in the draft. And some of you have had more exposure to this, some of you have had less, but we want to share with you a link. Paul, I think you're going to put a link to the Padlet in the chat box for us. And Padlet is one of those fun apps where we have the opportunity to go and provide quick feedback. We're putting our Post-it notes on a virtual wall. And would love to just take a couple minutes and answer a couple of questions there about what you're seeing. Just want to hear some of your cool and warm feedback, what concerns you have. And Paul, I can see you looking for that link. There it is. Elizabeth put it in the box. So you click on that link in the box and you're going to go to a blue grid and you see 3 questions up there. What are your questions about draft revised standards so far? What are you most excited about? And what are you most concerned about? So just take a couple minutes to put your first impressions, raise any kind of question you want with us. And we so appreciate kind of hearing the snap judgment. And I know you're going to take the opportunity as we go on down the road to give us more in-depth input around that survey. So I'm seeing some questions pop up. All you need to do when you go there is click the plus sign, and it gives you an opportunity to put your own Post-it on there and put your comments in the box. And I'm going to talk about a couple since I see questions coming up as we think about IC maps and SAI, the Standards Assessment Inventory we've had for, which is an assessment that teachers take to report on their professional learning experience aligned with the existing 7 standards for professional learning. We will have an aligned assessment with revised standards. We will have revised IC maps, and that's part of what sort of plays into our timeline on developing this whole system of revised standards. We want to make sure that we've got all those tools to help folks monitor their own learning, support the learning of those that they support, and also really get a lot more specific on what implementation looks like. All right, keep putting those comments in there. And I think, Paul, you're going to talk a little bit about timeline, which is going to answer some of these questions.
Oh, thank you, Tracy. And as you can see, we're excited to, now that the first draft has been released, to have this 6-week window until January 15th for public commentary. And that's the, we'll also make sure you have that link and you've received that both with the draft standards and the survey questions. And please feel free to share that with your stakeholders and your colleagues as well, which would be great until January 15th. You'll also see that we are going to be hard at work on looking, someone mentioned in the chat, which we appreciate the question from Tara, I believe, of the also the SAI, the updated standards assessment inventory, and the IC maps as well. And to also think more deeply about what revisions need to be made, as well as some monitoring and progress monitoring tools. that will be then released together with the final draft of standards. And this is kind of skipping ahead to the end of early 2022. So that it'll be intentional, both the release of the standards and the implementation and monitoring tools. Really with 2021, then continuing to work with our Standards Advisory Council, continuing to incorporate this feedback to release almost a 2.0 or second draft that would be in the mid 2021 before continuing the tool development and release as well. So that's why our advisory council and all of your work has been so invaluable so far. So that would be the kind of our high level view at this point for the standards advisory and the timeline for the standards revision.
And I've just put in the chat box, in case you didn't have the link handy elsewhere, the link to our draft and the survey. So thanks. The survey is lengthy. We are appreciating much feedback, and we also know that some of you may not be able to go into great detail. So whatever input you provide, we'd love it. We really want to know how these work, and we consider you our partners in this. So before Denise closes us up, I want to encourage you all to fill out the survey for this session. So we will put that link in the box, and it's been the same link any session you go to during this conference is taking you to the KickUp platform, and it asks you for your standards session number. So we'll just pop that in the chat box and ask you to provide feedback on this very session. So thanks very much. Thanks to the panel. Thanks to you all for being here. And Denise, close us up.
There I am. Had to unmute, but I want to thank this incredible panel. We don't always have the opportunity to get the kinds of insights and experiences, publications, research, people that have their that are on the pulse of all that's happening in field and in disciplines. And I just can't thank the panel enough. And I think all of you will see with the revision of the standards how deeply committed we are in going well beyond wanting people to adopt the standards at the state or at the district level. We really want to provide all of the standards, the tools necessary for real implementation and for monitoring the implementation of the standards and for supporting the implementation of the standards. So we really appreciate all the feedback you can get us, because we want it to be as close to perfect as possible when we actually put all of our the standards and the materials out there. But you all have already contributed so much, and we look forward to more. And again, thanks so much to our incredible panel and all of you that hung in there to learn so much more about what it is that we hope to do. Thank you.
And we will be heading to our afternoon keynote. So that will probably your next obligation or next opportunity is what I mean. And I hope you finish up a great day of learning at our Monday of our virtual conference. So we'll see you all soon. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, panelists.
Bye, everybody. Enjoy your
Bye.
Bye, Michelle. Thanks so much.
Thank you so
you
much.
guys. Thanks
Great
so
job,
much.
guys. Thanks.
Oh, Jim,
Jim.
you all did a great job. Eric and everybody. It's just Linda, thank you all so much.
All right. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hi there, guys. If it's okay with you, I'm going to go ahead and close the room now, or did you want to keep it open until the 45 mark?
I think you're good.
Okay, I will do that then. Thank you very much for everything. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.